Welcome to This Explainer. We're diving straight into a topic today that affects literally every single modern business out there: data security and GDPR compliance. We're going to break down exactly how to protect your organization's most valuable asset, which is, of course, your data, and we'll do it using clear, straightforward concepts. No PhD required. So if you're ready to master the essentials of encryption and figure out what regulators are actually looking for, you are in exactly the right place. Let's get to it. Take a second and really think about this scenario. What actually happens when your company's data gets stolen? It's a completely terrifying thought, right? But look, here is the stark reality of the digital age. Because cyber attacks are basically unavoidable for companies above a certain size today, data breaches are no longer a matter of if. They're entirely a matter of when. Processing personal data naturally carries an inherent risk. And since we can't just magically eliminate the threat of bad actors on the internet, we have to control how vulnerable our data is when they inevitably come knocking. All right, let's dive right into Section 1, the threat of data breaches, and why risk management is absolutely essential. Which brings us to Section 2, how encryption protects data. Think of this as your ultimate shield. You know, what's really interesting is just how simple the core concept of encryption actually is when you strip away the tech jargon. At its heart, encryption is simply a procedure. It takes your clear, easily readable text and mathematically scrambles it into what we call a hashed code. And to do this, it uses a specific digital key. Once that data is scrambled, it is entirely unreadable to anyone who might stumble across it. It minimizes your risks because it basically locks unauthorized third parties out of the data completely. So even if a hacker successfully breaks into your system and steals your files, all they're getting is useless scrambled gibberish, unless, of course, they also manage to steal the exact specific key required to unlock it. Let's move along and see how this builds, because it's a remarkably elegant four-step process. In step 1, you've got your clear text, say a customer's personal details. In step 2, the system applies that unique encryption key that transforms the data in step 3 into that secure hashed code. Now it can travel across networks or sit safely on a hard drive in this protected state. Finally, in step 4, when an authorized user actually needs to read that data, their system applies the correct key, reversing the whole process to reveal the original unlocked text. It happens seamlessly behind the scenes, but it forms an incredibly powerful barrier. Now here is a vitally important point that almost always gets overlooked. When we think of data breaches, we generally picture external hackers in dark hoodies, right? But encryption doesn't just stop external threats. It's actually one of your best defenses against internal data abuse too. By encrypting data, you are strictly limiting access only to authorized people within your own company who actually possess the right key. If an employee doesn't have the key, they literally can't snoop through sensitive files. It compartmentalizes your risk beautifully. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Section 3, decoding GDPR requirements and navigating the rulebook. Take a look at this quote directly from GDPR Article 32, paragraph 1. This is literally the cornerstone of European data security law. It places the responsibility squarely on the data controller and the processor to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to secure personal data. Now, you might notice the GDPR deliberately avoids mandating specific technologies here. Why? Well, because they want to accommodate individual business factors, and, frankly, they know technological progress moves incredibly fast. A law naming a specific software would be outdated in a matter of months. However, in its non-exhaustive list of potential measures, the GDPR does explicitly mention encryption by name, so it is highly, highly recommended. So if the law won't explicitly tell you which exact software to buy, how on earth do you decide what's quote-unquote appropriate? Well, the GDPR gives you a specific catalog of criteria to evaluate. You have to look at what is currently the state of the art. You are completely allowed to consider implementation costs. You absolutely must evaluate the nature, scope, context, and purposes of your data processing. And most importantly, you have to weigh the severity of the risks to the rights and freedoms of the people whose data you hold, right alongside how likely those risks are to actually happen. You essentially take all of these ingredients, put them in a bowl, mix them up, and that determines your security strategy. This creates a really crucial sliding scale of responsibility. For example, if you're operating in a low-risk scenario, let's say you're handling basic, non-sensitive data for just a brief period, well, your required security measures might be relatively straightforward. But if you're in a high-risk scenario, processing massive amounts of highly sensitive personal data, the likelihood and the severity of a breach skyrocket. The rule of thumb under GDPR is super simple. The higher the risk, and the more likely it is to happen, the stronger and more numerous your security measures absolutely must be. Let's pause and translate some of that legal jargon from earlier. What exactly does state-of-the-art even mean? I mean, it sounds like a marketing buzzword, right? But in the context of GDPR, it carries real practical weight. To answer this, data protection officers don't just guess. They usually rely on established information security standards. Frameworks like the ISO/IAC 27001, or even specific national IT security guidelines, are what define what state-of-the-art looks like today. Adhering to those established standards is exactly how you prove to regulators that your encryption methods are actually up to the task. Which brings us to our final section, Section 4, Hidden Benefits of Encryption, or as I like to call it, the unexpected payoff. Picture this. An employee accidentally leaves a mobile hard drive completely full of personal data sitting on a train. Normally, absolute panic ensues. But if that drive is protected by state-of-the-art encryption, losing it might not necessarily be considered a reportable data breach to the authorities because the data is 100% unreadable to whoever finds that drive. The risk to the individuals is basically zero. By utilizing encryption, a company can literally save itself from an administrative nightmare, a total public relations disaster, and the sheer panic of a full-blown breach response. It's a massive relief. And that brilliantly illustrates a point tucked away in Article 83(2)(c) of the GDPR. Let's say the absolute worst happens, and despite your very best efforts, a breach does occur, and you find yourself facing the regulators. Under this specific article, authorities are legally required to positively consider your use of encryption when they're deciding whether to impose a fine and when determining how big that fine should be. By proving you took encryption seriously, you essentially have a built-in mitigating factor that can drastically reduce your legal and financial exposure. It really does pay to be prepared. So we're left with this final, crucial question for today's explainer. Is your data truly a secret, or is it just waiting to be read by the wrong person? We've seen just how unavoidable these risks are today, how elegantly encryption solves the problem by converting text to a hashed code, and how heavily the GDPR rewards you for implementing state-of-the-art measures. So take a really hard look at your own organization's practices today. Are you leveraging encryption to fully protect your customers, your employees, and your bottom line? I genuinely hope this journey has empowered you to make sure the answer to that question is a resounding yes. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. And remember, keep asking the right questions about your data.